All right, everyone, we're back now, and we're going to talk about shade cloth. So the first question I get asked a lot is what percentage shade cloth? So one thing I like to say is it doesn't matter whether you're in the north or in the south, how long your days are. Eventually, I think you're going to need shade cloth just due to the fact that a hoop house is designed to increase the temperature in the growing environment, and you are going to need to reduce that temperature. So if it's 90 degrees where you're at today in the summertime, it's probably going to be 10 to 15 degrees hotter in your hoop house than the outside ambient temperature, which means you're going to need to cool it down. A lot of crops aren't going to grow at 100 or 105 degrees. So depending on how long your days are, traditionally, if you're above the 40th parallel, we're going to recommend 30% shade cloth. If you are below the 40th parallel, we'll call that Kansas City, and south of that you're going to need 50%. Days are longer in the south, and you need a little bit more shade. So 50% below the 40th parallel, 30% above. Now, the shade cloth comes in two different colors. We have black, it's a little bit less expensive. We also have white. Now, the black will shade your hoop house the same as the white does, but the white has some benefits that the black does not. One, it is white, which means it doesn't get as hot from the sun. The other is the white has a chromatic material in it, which makes it reflective. So when the light hits it, it actually breaks the light up. It diffuses it inside the hoop house, and in some cases this can yield you more foliage or more usable light for your plants. Installing the shade cloth is very similar to installing plastic. It's going to go from the hip board on one side of your hoop house over the hoop house to the other side to the other hip board. You're going to pull it down tight, install it, whether you put it in a lock channel or use some type of clips with rope or paracord to attach to the ground. It's going to go traditionally from hip board to hip board and from end wall to end wall.
So a couple things on those two notes. You're going to notice that when you're working inside of a hoop house that there is hardly a trace of a shadow. So if you put your hand out and the sun is here and the ground is down below, that because of the diffusion in the plastic and because of the added diffusion in shade cloth, the light is scattered. So when Julian was talking about that light is bent and scattered around, that means that more light is spreading around. So there's a difference between looking at a light bulb with and without a lampshade. You know, you can completely look directly into the light bulb and it hurts your eyes, versus if you put something in between you and it kind of scatters the light around. It's more pleasant for you, your employees, and it's more pleasant for the plant. So it's just a much better working environment. So again, on the shade cloth, when you install it, it doesn't have to be as tight because the air is moving through the fabric versus getting up under it and having the lift. So it's much more forgiving, and in fact, I would keep it just a little loose. I mean, not super loose, but you don't have to worry about getting it extra tight because the wind isn't going to pick it up and drag it off of your house.
There are different weaves or knitting of shade cloth. And the reason I want to talk about this is that if you have a woven shade cloth, you cannot trim it, which means if you cut it along the length of it, it is going to unravel because of the way that it's actually woven together. On a knitted fabric, you can think about it as somebody crocheting a blanket. If you cut one of the pieces and pull the whole string out, it's going to separate into two different pieces, which means now you have two pieces, but it's not going to unravel at the ends.
So if you're ordering shade cloth from us and you get it knitted, I always like to suggest people, especially if they're doing leafy greens or lettuce year-round, that they order a little bit extra. They can cut it in the field, and whatever's left over, or if you get enough to cover your whole house, you do have the opportunity to use this further into the summer with microclimates. So to further reduce the shade or the temperature in an area of your hoop house where you have maybe some specialty greens or some cut greens, they might like it a little extra shady. play with that a little bit. Order enough to do some testing and to see if your plants react better to multiple layers of shade cloth with those microclimates. Just wanted to point that out. And then the very last thing, and this is, I love that when we were outlining this series, you brought this up, that a shade cloth is not a sunshade.
Yeah, it is, shade cloth is to create shade. Sunshade, which is a name brand or a type of material, it does just that. It makes nothing but shade.
So think of awnings or something like that.
Right. So a lot of those cloths, they'll tell you that they have a percentage to it. And the reason they do is because they still do let some light and they let air through them. But traditionally, they are designed to make just that, and that is shade, and a lot of it. So in our case, in the greenhouses, we don't need that much shade. It's traditionally has about a 15 or a 20% amount of light that comes through it, which means it's going to be 80 to 85% shade, which is way too much for a greenhouse.
A lot of times if you're shopping for shade, you're going to see 70, 80, 90% shade cloth, and you're like, well, do I need that or do I not? Given who we're primarily dealing with, which is market gardeners, cut flower folks that may have mixed crops in there, the 30 and 50 is all we stock because that's primarily all we need. The reason you see these higher percentages is that's coming straight from the ornamental side of the greenhouse industry, where you may have things like Aralias, Pittosporum, different type of shrubs and ferns that require almost total shade. And so that really helps break that up. But again, you're seeing that in very specialized hoop houses and greenhouses, typically with monocrops or with crops that require the same shade percentages. It's not just random that they're throwing these out there. It's made specifically for certain types of plants and ornamentals. Now, earlier when I talked about these microclimates, you may find that some of your greens require a little bit more shade than others. So that's why it's worth playing with. But don't get tied up thinking, well, I may need 60 to 80 because I live in South Florida, or I live in Arkansas, or I live in Arizona. It's simply tailored to a specific variety. And for the most part, shade cloth came from the ornamental industry, and we were able to steal it in vegetable production. So just if you see that, that's why that some of that is the way it is. And so that kind of covers it for shade. And up next, we're going to talk about greenhouse bracing for wind and snow.